Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a pleasure to introduce again Dr. David Lahti, who is Assistant Professor of Biology and the Undergraduate Research Coordinator at Queen's College, City University of New York, where he runs a Behavior and Evolution Laboratory, focusing mainly on learned behavior in birds and humans. He's got 2 PhDs, which is one from the Whitfield Institute in Oxford, and which is more on the moral philosophy and philosophy of biology, and one from the University of Michigan for a study on ecology and the evolutionary biology, and involving the rapid evolution in an introduced bird. But now we're on to, has religion evolved? And I shall be most interested in what you have to say about that.
Thanks, Rodney, and thank you again for coming. Especially, I know firsthand the draw that going into town after lunch can have, and so I appreciate that you've all come back here. Yeah, that's right. My interest in the evolution of religion started really with my graduate work in the evolution of morality, and I found that they were inextricably intertwined. When I looked at the prehistory of morality, I ended up dealing with religion, and so now this is the first time, though, that I will be dealing primarily with religion and only giving morality a passing glance. Usually it's the other way around, so we'll see how it goes. Anyway, I'd like to address the question of whether religion is a product of history, or whether it's derived from precursors like other cultural institutions that we have, and like humans ourselves. And I think that this question of whether it does have a history, which is all I mean by has religion evolved, interacts only very distantly and weakly with the major religious questions themselves. And so whether this question has an affirmative answer or not, and what that answer turns out to be, I think will have very little relevance actually for the major religious questions like the existence of God, good and evil, afterlife, any of these kinds of issues. Yet, regardless, I find it very rewarding and exciting to look into the evolution of our capacity for religion, and then later what I'm going to talk more about today is the evolution of religion, the way it just happens to have turned out since that capacity did evolve. So talking about these issues can be difficult, as you all undoubtedly know, because the evolution of religion relates to the evolution of humans, and lots of humans have a problem with their own evolution, or the idea that they evolved. And so if you look here, I know this is sort of a complicated graph, I'll just tell you that this is Americans with that same, from that same think tank I told you about before, which was the National Opinion Research Center in Chicago. We're asked the question, or we're given the statement, human beings developed from earlier species of animals. And by the way, developed is an incorrect word to use, as you know, it should be evolved. I don't believe that human beings develop from earlier species of animals. That would be quite a trick. But anyway, and then also to give their religion, and then religiosity, strong or not strong, and then education. Of course, all these people were either Christians or nothing. So religion means denomination. And I find 3 interesting trends in this graph. So the first one is the difference between people of different religious affiliations. So on the left, we have fundamentalist Protestant. You can see that the bars are low. That's the acceptance of evolution of humans. Fundamentalist Protestant, then moderate Protestant, then liberal, Catholic, and no affiliation. And we have a line up like that. Then the difference between strong and not strong religiosity, strength in religiosity, whatever that means to the people who said that, tends to depress their tendency to believe or accept human evolution. And of course, the people who have no affiliation do not have that the option to be strongly religious about their lack of religion. And the third interesting thing that I see here is that unless you are a fundamentalist Protestant that considers yourself strongly religious, 4 years of college is the threshold for then doubling your chances of accepting human evolution. So in contradistinction to the result I gave you in the last lecture about understanding the relationship between genes and environment, to some extent, education, at least at the college level, does improve the tendency for people to accept human evolution. But it's definitely not, on the whole, very encouraging at this point. All right. Now, one reason why people have objections, religious sensitive problems, accepting the fact that humans evolved, which is a precursor, of course, or a prerequisite for even talking about the evolution of religion, is a perceived loss of human dignity. Now, I've asked many, many people what their objection is to human evolution. And to tell you the truth, unless I was in an academic setting where people were thinking about theology and biblical boundaries to accepting evolution, so biblical theological objections, I should say, this gut reaction of thinking that humans are more important than that, or better than that, or not wanting to be infected with being related to nature, and this whole kind of thing, seem to be primary. The biblical and theological objections, while being important for argument, did not seem to be the reason why they objected to human evolution, the primary reason. And I've been surprised at this for a long time, actually, because the three Abrahamic religions, and we're taught this in Sunday school too, on a general level, not related to evolution, but including the traditions or the denominations that typically have the biggest problem with evolution, they don't require, to my knowledge, that humans be dignified naturally or inherently. It seems, or at least I was taught in my Lutheran tradition, that dignity was bestowed upon us by God. And a matter of fact, Genesis says we're created from dirt. I mean, that's not a very auspicious beginning. The Psalm says, who is man that God is mindful of us in the first place, or should care about us? And in the doctrine of the fall, it's not nature that corrupts humans. If anything, on some interpretations, or on all interpretations of the fall, it's humans that corrupt ourselves. But on some interpretations, it's humans that corrupt the rest of nature. I mean, so that's the dignity problem is going in the wrong direction in this case. So from the biblical perspective, there's very little call to protect human dignity from the corrupting influence of natural ancestry, I think. And in fact, there's quite a bit to warn us about taking ourselves too seriously or thinking too highly of ourselves. I'll largely leave aside in this little diatribe the other two major religions, Buddhism and Hinduism, except to mention that, the reason I'll leave them aside is because they don't generally have a problem with accepting human evolution. On the other hand, I think Buddhists and Hindus who come to accept human evolution or understand it have to be extra careful, because there's nothing like evolution in the intellectual history of typical believers in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. The closest thing is the Great Chain of Being, but you don't move up it. You just stay where you are. And so the idea of evolution is present in Buddhism and Hinduism, and so they have to be especially careful to distinguish, because things like teleology and progressivism are much, much stronger in those traditions than they are in evolutionary biology as a science. So I'd argue that we can look at religion much like we can look at this church here. This is Salisbury Cathedral. It's rooted in the humble earth in a physical, mundane sense. But it's not that gives religion its distinctiveness, because that's common to any building or any cultural institution, to the other side of the metaphor. It's rather the vaulted nave and the steeple pointing at things that are much more lofty that gives this church its distinctiveness, and that's the same thing about religion, that gives it its distinctiveness. And so, nevertheless, the humble and the lofty are still part of the same story. I'm just going to be talking about the way in which religion is human, the way in which it is rooted in the mundane things like evolution. So, oh, actually, yeah, and this dual nature of humanity and much of human experience and thought has been recognized for a long time, both in sacred and in secular thought. So Alexander Pope, 18th century thinker, who's sort of part sacred and part secular, sort of, wrote a great essay on man. And in his poetic essay, he says, "Placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, he hangs between in doubt to act or rest, and doubt to deem himself a god or beast." Now this illustrates very well, and actually this whole section of the essay on man develops very well this perennial tension that many thinkers and thinkers, poets throughout the history of Western and Eastern thought have found the tension between thinking of ourselves as a part of nature and apart from nature. And in fact, we're probably being too extreme if we denigrate one for the sake of the other, either way. So with that long introduction, and probably it was unnecessary for most of you, but if we can set aside objections to talking about the natural history of religion, that aspect of it, at least for the sake of argument, I'd like to walk through what I would consider to be a plausible sequence of events in its prehistory. This is a ball of interacting hypotheses that I've constructed hypothetically on the basis of current evidence in physical anthropology, archaeology, with guidance from evolutionary psychology, evolutionary theory, and social psychology. And so I'm developing this as one long hypothesis, basically. But first, we need to talk about what I'm talking about when we say evolution of religion. I need to talk about these preliminary issues. So evolution of religion itself could refer to the evolution of our capacity for religion. I'm not actually going to talk about that because I don't believe, given the recency, relatively speaking, tens of thousands of years, that of what I would call something that can satisfy a robust definition of religion, that the capacity was evolved for the purpose or for the function, in other words, natural selection for religiosity itself. I think, if anything, we will see genetic evolution and refinements to religion over the last tens of thousands of years. But the capacity for religion, I believe, was there before we start this story that I'm about to start, which is about 100,000 years ago. And then we could be referring also to cultural universals, that aspect of religion which is shared by everyone who professes any religion at all. It may be those even who don't profess a religion, because based on your definition of religion, everybody might be religious. Or the evolution of religion could refer to particular cultural manifestations of religion. I'm not going to deal much about that. That's more a matter of history than it is prehistory, although there is definitely some prehistory to it. And now, the other word, though, evolution. I've already been conflating this a little bit, or not in my own head, but I haven't been clear with you about what I mean. Evolution could refer to genetic change. That's really what evolution is if I were to talk to a bunch of biologists. And I would have to have used another word if I were going to refer to cultural change. Some people accept the term cultural evolution, but sometimes people don't even like the word evolution in there because it's confusing. I am okay, at least in this context, with using the term cultural evolution as long as you realize that the spread of information there is through ideas that are contracted by social learning instead of the spread of alleles and genes which are contracted by inheritance. So it's a parallel mode of evolution, but the general process is the same even though it's a very different pathway. Okay. I should deal with this, but I will just gloss over this very quickly. What is religion? There are a whole bunch of different approaches to religion. I once thought of this as I went to a morphometrics talk where people would be looking at, let's say, the shape of a lizard, and they would move it around in 3D space, and it looks like a chart, but it's a 3D chart. And you can look at this from all different perspectives, and you're looking at the same thing, but you carve it up in different ways. There are a whole bunch of ways to carve it up. One that kind of is nice because of its alliteration is, I don't know how people do this, they find, did it work out that way? Just happened to work out that way? Anyway, Catherine Albanese has this idea of creed, code, cultus, which is like ritual, and community. That's carving up religion as an anthropologist would see it in its outward manifestations. Another way to look at it, a second formulation, is carving in a three-part kind of thing where you deal with truth, meaning, and purpose in one, goodness and love, sort of moral stuff in another one, and then devotional aspects in the third. And this could be what what you could consider the spiritual, carving it up spiritually, like the inward experience of religion rather than the outward manifestation of it. But these are both professional in a sense, so what I did is I asked religious people in Ann Arbor, Michigan, so you know it's going to be biased towards heartland, Midwest, conservative, Protestant Christianity, if you don't mind a whole bunch of labels there, what they thought religion was to them, and then I prioritized it based on the commonality. So it's a descending order of the commonality of what they said religion was to them. I let them make as long of a list as they would like, and this is basically what I got. Beliefs and morality, so truth and morals were at the top, and religious experience is way down here at the bottom. I suspect if I went down south, there would be a little bit of a different order of things, but regardless, I don't need to tell you what religion is anyway, but for the purposes of this lecture, I will not be able to trace all of these aspects back, even though I think that would be, and it's never been done before, I think that would be, even in hypothetical ways, never been done before, the best way to talk about the prehistory, natural history of religion would be to take all of its important aspects and try to trace these back, because they may not have the same history. But I'm going to walk through a sequence of events. I'll go back and forth between what our best knowledge is of what humans in our ancestry were doing at a particular time. And so I'm going to introduce watershed dates. Whether we are sure about these watershed dates or not, of course we're not really sure about them, but it can be helpful. And I think they're approximately right. If anything, they'll be pushed a little bit further back. Because things made of stone versus things made of wood, they could have been similar things made of wood, and of course that would push things back because we don't know about those, because they've gone away. That kind of thing. And so I'll go back and forth between that kind of physical anthropological and behavioral anthropological descriptions, and then what I think that means for the prehistory of religion. So I'll go back and forth. All right. So I'll start where I often, to biologists, end, which is at 100,000 years ago, which is when we're cognitively and morphologically human, fully human, modern humans. Not much changed after this point in terms of major features of the human phenotype. There's certainly evolution since then. We've seen a substantial brain size increase since then, but not anywhere near as much as we saw in the 500,000 years before this, for instance. And what had happened up to this point, I would say, only would be, I would only want to credit it with the term pre-moral sociality. It's cooperation. It's things that we largely share with other animals, although at this point, even at 1 million years ago, this is a log scale on the bottom. Yeah. Even at 1 million years ago, it was far beyond what we see in any other unrelated group. In other words, a non-eusocial group of organisms. In other words, a group of organisms, humans, that are interacting with individuals that are not clones of ourselves. Okay, now, what happened after this pre-moral sociality, this ordinary cooperation within kin groups and reciprocal interactions that we share, at least in principle, with other organisms? Well, this group of 9 is, I think, what the things that happened that have the most relevance for religion, that are first seen in the human lineage between about 100,000 and 40,000 years ago. I put them in descending order of what I think their importance is for understanding what we were likely to have been like religiously at this time. And this is, of course, not a photograph of someone from back then, but the cow people of Africa who live very similarly to what I would expect that the people on the sort of cutting edge of these things were living like by about 40,000 years ago. So I should emphasize that there are people groups that we are still very, very diverse. And just as it is in nature, just because you draw a line, that I'm drawing a line back from, back through a very selective group of organisms, back through our human ancestry, and I'm ignoring all the side roads and the developments that do not lead to where we are today particularly. So the cow of Africa are certainly not living the same way they were living 40,000 years ago, but I think they are living much like the way we were living 40,000 years ago, unless any of you people come from one of these hunter-gatherer societies that I might bring up. Anyway, as I mentioned before, I think that these are in descending order of their importance to religion. So verbal communication and development of symbolic thought and the conversion of that to actual language with grammar and symbolic representation, essentially a metaphorical means of verbally communicating, is something that would have been radically new at this time, even though the precursors were present earlier. And there's a strengthening of social hierarchies that happens. I can't get into all the reasons why this tended to happen. It's related to a whole bunch of other things that were going on at the time. We are all in Africa, by the way. Nobody has left at this point in the early part of this period, but by the end of the period, people have populated the entire globe, just about. And there's burial, possibly even in the beginning of this period, with ceremony. So there's this red ochre that is, some people use it to say, oh, there's religious belief. I don't go that far. I'm relatively conservative about this kind of stuff. There are some people who want to push things way, way back on the basis of very, what I would consider to be flimsy evidence. I would say that red ochre does suggest some degree of ceremony or an importance given to the burial, but I would not necessarily think that it illustrates religious belief. And care for the sick and the old, which is evident from healed wounds that would have been fatal if they hadn't been cared for. These types of things illustrate what I would consider to be a moral development, or a development pre-moral anyway. So, what do I think this means regarding religion at this time? So the first watershed date, again, I would say is between about 100,000 years ago and 80,000 in the beginning. That's broadly the time period that's been suggested by evolutionary linguists like Tecumseh Fitch and Pinker, and that would permit the expression of explicit rules and the justification and definition of roles. And so I would say that once we have that in the human lineage, we have the capacity for a kind of morality. So I'm going to define morality here as explicit rule following. Not just I convey to you that I want you to do something, but the actual explication of a rule that then can be followed or not followed. I use that as the definition of morality as opposed to just submitting to someone else's desire. So even leadership roles can be explicated once you have symbolic representation, even by third parties. Now these rules would be perceived as arising within a social group, of course, because at this time there is no evidence that we have networks of interactions among people in this early period of, in the beginning, 100 to 80,000 years ago. The reason I have this extending down here into even 5,000 years ago is because it's still, there are many cultures that still live like this up into this point. So I have the bar spreading like this. And when I don't know when precisely it began or ended, I just put these hatch bars on. But I think this is the central point here. So I think morality would be thoroughly parochial at this time because the kin group, the clan, is the fundamental unit, and not only the fundamental unit, but nearly the only unit of intense social interaction in the early part of this period. Now this, I believe, would have been compatible with a pre-religious animism, I call it. So I'm putting the bars for religious development up on the top and the bars for moral on the bottom. I just said development. You notice that? Sorry about that. It's common, but I think we should really stick to separating development and evolution because it can confuse people, especially people who think that you might not understand evolution or believe in evolution. Anyway, pre-religious animism is essentially when people recognize inscrutable powers that may require appeasement. And probably more importantly than that, once the rules can survive the death of the elder who gave them, it makes a lot of sense for the possibility can arise for the elder to survive the death. The rules survive the death first, and then along with that, I think that I will follow people like Lyle Steadman and Craig Palmer, who say that ancestor worship is probably universal in the history of human religion. Every society seems to have gone through such a phase. And indeed, the following of rules instituted by elders after they die, if you think about it, it's a very mild slide from going from grandfather would have wanted you to do this to grandfather wants you to do this. I'm not saying semantics governed their opinions about things, but I'm saying that it's a very small step here, and those elders may still be around in some, even a literal sense. Now consider two things about this stage in our evolution that I want to emphasize. One is that the fact that these capacities are present in roughly similar form, these tendencies are present in roughly similar form regardless of where you are in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, outside of Sub-Saharan Africa, suggests to me that they evolved within Africa, culturally evolved within Africa, because the things that didn't look quite different. And you would expect that they would if they co-evolved. That's not even the right word. If they were convergent on each other by even culturally evolving in two places at the same time. So that's another reason to place it between 180,000 years ago, because we were still there at 100,000 years ago. We meaning the entire species. And secondly, I don't think that morality or religion could have evolved much complexity before the advent of language. And it just so happens that that is relatively the same time period. Because anything that you had in terms of a moral rule, or even more importantly, in terms of opinions about supernatural beings, or spirits, or powers, would have been stuck in your own head. You would not have been able to communicate them very effectively until we had a very robust symbolic, metaphorical language. But unlike some others, I don't think that language was cognitively necessary. I think the cognition was already in place. It was merely practically necessary for the conveyance of ideas about the supernatural, or about anything for that matter. And so it probably happened very rapidly whenever it did happen. Okay, let's go forward now. We get to about 40,000 years, which is I think the next time after somewhere between 180,000 years, somewhere between 40 and 35, but I would, it's some very recent evidence I was looking at even on the plane over here suggests that it really is going to be pretty close to 40, if not even a little earlier than that. Is another watershed time where we definitely see a burst of creativity that we have just not seen anything like before this period. We have art, we have heavily ritualized burial with very expensive things that would have taken a long time to make, buried with the people. We have much more advanced technology for hunting and war, and we have clothing, including decorative clothing, all just like bursting on the scene almost at once. And I skipped the top one, which is between group alliances. I think that the extension of social interaction, the increase in movement, and the broader social interactions are the reason for much of this. I don't think there was anything in the brain that necessarily changed. I think we have between group alliances, and here are the Quinnipiac Indians, and this was, it's a recent painting painted by a Quinnipiac American Indian. And I'm not saying that those people even existed back then, they didn't. It's just this scene right here, which would have been typical of pre-Columbian certainly, and maybe even 200, 300 years ago, interactions between different groups of the same tribe of Indians coming together and agreeing to share, in this case, women and also kills, and to cooperate in kills, is something that anthropologists say began in about 40,000 years ago in at least a couple places, and then shortly after that, many others. I mean, we have 38,000 years ago evidence for this in France, and we have 35,000 years ago evidence in Australia. And so we have this literally all over the place, art and evidence of increased contact between human groups. Here's another sort of convergent example, the canela of Brazil in their ritualized adornment in clothing. This is a figurine. It's currently, I believe, the earliest yet known fertility figurine, or any kind of figurine or sculpture that is pretty much universally agreed to have a religious connotation or function to it. This is 35 to 40,000 years old. The authors suggest 40, but the worst critic said 35, so not bad. It was taken from Hohlefels cave in Germany, and as a fertility figurine, it may have represented a sort of worship or an appeal to powers or entities beyond the natural. And this is a long-standing way to interpret those kinds of figurines because of their descendants in cultures today, as well as the particular things that they were representing. Now, this is an example of what I was telling you about ritualized burial. This is from Sungir near Moscow, Russia, in the same time period here, so about 28,000 years ago, so it's about 10,000 years after that figurine. And it contains a great deal of jewelry from head to toe, and including all of these ivory beads. And this is what they look like in cross-section in the string we're going through there. And it's estimated, based on the best, some anthropologists, I think this would probably be the kind of anthropologist I'd be if I were working on this. They learn to make the things themselves, and they see how long it would take and how you possibly could make them, like Thor Heyerdahl building the Kon-Tiki Ra to go across the oceans. That's the way they try to figure out how they would have made these and how wealthy or how valuable these things would have been. It's estimated that if you were a bit better, if you had generations and generations to hone the skill, it would probably take you an hour to make each one of them, and there are tens of thousands of them on this one body near Moscow, Russia. And so it's hard for a lot of people to believe. This is relatively strong evidence. I mean, hardly an anthropologist would disagree with the contention now that something like this would illustrate some kind of belief in the afterlife, or at least something that would make you think that these beads are not being wasted on this dead person. It's not done probably just for sympathy. And one evidence for that is we don't find this before. We don't find this before, and there is certainly burial. So something has changed, and it never goes away again once it comes. So I suggest, again, about 40 to 35,000 years ago as the next watershed time in the history of religion. And that is what I call parochial religion. I suggest here that ancestor worship generally evolved into, culturally, or coexisted with, because there are examples of this as well, with an emerging polytheism. And I don't mean that any one culture believed in many gods, but it is possible. But there were many gods recognized by a given culture. There could have been gods that were recognized as being someone else's, for instance. And magic and local spirits were likely still common because they tend to be in groups that are like this today. Now I call this parochial religion because I call it religion because it begins to address the deep issues that were brought up in the definitions of religion. So I believe that a religion, whatever definition you use, it has to get at the thing that is considered by the people to be the most fundamental in their life. And earlier examples of religion, which have modern convergence or analogs in certain peoples, it is not the most fundamental thing in their life. Sometimes it's just a bother. And sometimes it's on par, the ancestors are on par with living elders. That's why I call that pre-religious animism. Sometime during the ancestor period, the ancestor worship period, or this early globally polytheistic period, I would say we're entering into religion where these entities are seen as something that is fundamentally important to human life and even can answer major questions to human life. Now, and the reason I'm suggesting that they weren't universal, because a lot of people think a universal idea of one God over all would have been primary, is that I don't see any reason to assume that they would have done that unless it disappeared in all of the groups that are like this today. It would have to be a mass extinction of these early monotheisms. Rather, it seems that the most we tend to get is that a culture is monotheistic but highly relativistic in who counts as a child of God, if you know what I mean. So in other words, it's a God of us and there is nobody else. People outside don't even count. And that's very common in groups whose name for themselves are just people or humans or something like that. There's a lot of groups like that. So I think it would have been something like this. But the ancestors had broken the ice for belief in supernatural persons, and supernatural persons who are interested in them, as a parent is interested in children, or as a creator is interested in the art that is made. And so I would say that local and regional gods could have taken the places of the ancestors, or that the ancestors could have even transformed into them. And these, we have examples of these today, but I think that this was much more common in our history than it is today.
You've lost the power.
I think it may have gone to sleep actually.
Oh.
Or something. It's got the little red light flashing away. And
Let's
Zoe
see.
knows that. Where's Zoe? She knows how to fix it.
Status.
Yeah, it's alive, but I lit the bulb when I went to sleep.
This is when I do my Morris dancing.
It's yeah, I think it's gone to sleep. There is a cycle that you have to go through, and Zoe knows the
Is this
cycle.
it?
I don't. Well, no, you have to use this button here actually. But I'm fearing it might be quicker for you have to go off. You actually have to switch it off, and then it has to warm up again.
Oh.
Should we just go for it?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's just go for it.
Well, yeah.
Possibly.
Anthropology, very.
Well, I'll keep on going.
Keep talking, and then we'll get
Yeah.
Zoe on board. Yeah.
All right. So I would say the increase in discussion or a interaction between groups is really what facilitated an expansion of moral considerability. So even though I don't have a new bar for morality at this time, because I think it's just an extension of what had been going on before, I think morality is universalizing at this time. Not universalizing, that's too strong of a word, but it is being extended necessarily to other groups. Because one's own ancestors, and this I think is the reason why this is what happened at this precise time, is that one's own ancestors could not possibly adjudicate disputes between different groups. There's two incommensurable sources of morality here. And so what you need to have is either the ancestors growing in power, in breadth, or you need to have some kind of agreement of a relationship between them, or some new god that arises, let's say a spirit that both of them respect, or something like that. So, and this is actually given oftentimes as a report of why groups are in transition. And so we see that sometimes today, such as in Indonesia, where the urban part of Indonesia is growing quite much and sort of pushing groups together, and they're having to interact with each other more than you would expect, and these very kinds of changes are happening there. So what I would suggest is that that's what happened as our density was growing and our interactions with each other were intensifying during evolutionary or cultural evolutionary history. Now, the next stage I want to talk about starts at around 12,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution. Now again, I'm not saying that everybody developed agriculture around this time, but it's the first time that we see these crucial things happening in the history, cultural history of humans, and I think it makes a difference for the evolution of religion, or the prehistory of religion. Now, the things that were around during the last 12,000 years that had never been seen before in the history of humanity that I think are important for understanding religion are, first, agriculture, secondly, the domestication of animals, and that relates to agriculture. Both of those together would have allowed us to remain in one place for much longer than we would have been able to before. Matter of fact, permanently. So there were different points. One was at about 400,000 years ago. One is another point was at about 100,000 years ago, when when the nomadic lifestyle of the most sedentary peoples was curtailed to some extent. But here, for the first time in human history, we can stay in one place forever because we're raising our own food. And I think this is important because then densities can increase, and also technological advancement in cities as such, and also complex political organization can develop because you're not moving around. Now, moving into the discussion of cities, complex political organization, from there we get written language, and it's not known how the growth of cities leads to written language, but it does seem to be in the same places that we first see written language. So far it seems to have been to have developed independently in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Harappa in modern-day Pakistan about 5,500 years ago. And the Harappa used to be younger, but now it seems to be the oldest so far. You know, we're going to play leapfrog with these three societies, I'm sure, and others might even join the race, pushing it back a little bit by a little bit. There was just a recent block with writing found on it that pushed it back another 400 years. All right, so shortly after the advent of written language, we have codes of law and morality, almost immediately afterwards. So, for instance, you want me to turn it back on now?
Yeah.
Don't blink at me. All right, so an example of one of the world's earliest cities is Babylon, which you can see here at nighttime. And since there were no lights over there, you can't see Hammurabi's law code either, which developed remarkably soon after the... Oh, you can. Okay. Sunrises used to be instant back then. So this law book was written soon after the rise of this great city here. By great, I mean very large. And this law book, even though it's the first one that we have, it was sufficiently progressive and advanced and apparently revised to suggest many previous incarnations, whether of this law or of other kinds that Hammurabi might have known about. So it's probably not the first. Okay, so I suggest 12 to 10,000 years ago, those major events that had happened in the wake of agriculture as the third watershed time in the history of religion. Kicking off what I call the universalization of religion for the first time in our history. So if you require religion to be universal in order to consider it religion, then this is where religion begins for you, I think, if my ball of hypotheses is correct. Anyway, so first, with the growth of denser population centers and interaction with other people who were not only not related to you, but weren't even in any kind of affiliation or alliance with you. You would have met people in these centers that were distantly related, and so the same issue that faces two groups that come into contact with each other for the first time in terms of irreconcilable moralities based on irreconcilable ancestors or gods would have faced people in these dense population centers to a much greater extent. And so I would say that morality began to universalize, and I would say that this is a process. That's why I call it universalizing morality down here. because it's still happening today. And a matter of fact, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're starting to become more interested in our impacts on the natural world, because essentially we're learning that our behavior can impact that in a much greater way. And so, in line with my hypothesis as to how morality tends to evolve all the time, it's only then when you have a crisis situation, essentially, and you realize your behavior is interacting with others, but you don't have any standards on which to adjudicate what you should and shouldn't do. Now we're starting to formulate an environmental ethic. There was environmental concern before, but systematic environmental ethics is a very new thing in any religion or society. Okay, now I suggest that, why did that happen? Oh, it turned on, it turned off again, I see. So
It thinks it's all up here.
yeah, just flipped
Yeah,
on.
just flipped up.
All right.
Flipped up.
Well, maybe we can go through the same thing again. As long as I get the last slide, that would be good, because I'll be spending a little bit of time on it. But, so maybe I should turn this off.
Do you want to press that?
I just pressed it, so while it's blinking, I think it can't be messed with. But anyway, all right. So, where was I here? Oh yeah, I suggest also at this point, with the universalization of morality, that religion started to universalize as well. So, in some societies, appeasing or worshiping a variety of gods would have given way, or just supplemented by a single most powerful, or eventually all-powerful God. And from these societies, now we're not even in prehistory. We know about what some of these gods were and where they came from, whose god they were before they became the Ishtar of Babylon or Ra. So the favoritism of a single deity above others, and the tendency increasingly over history to attribute natural phenomena and natural events and features to them, that marks a transition, I would say, an important transition from seeing nature as chaotic, as fraught with competition by many forces, which is the animistic polytheistic view. Transition from that to a view where there is a regularity to nature and a reliability, as if it were, but in most cases, we're talking in the early period of writing, it was considered to be controlled by a single personality or power. Personality more likely in the West, power more likely in the East. And so a cosmopolitan social environment, what I'm saying to summarize this, and an increased human control of nature through domestication and through settling areas permanently and agriculture, would have led Neolithic agricultural societies at least part of the way towards monotheism and the universalization of both morality and religion. And this last bit is something that has been talked about for quite a while. That's not my hypothesis per se. Right. Now this slide is just the symbols of the 5 major religions. So it's just, now, I, as a sort of a last stage in the evolution of monotheism, per se, I would say that a chief god could only maintain an orderly universe if competing gods had no say, so that they were very weak, if they were assimilated, the way they tended to be in the East, or if they had no existence, like tended to be the case in the West. And so one could only, speaking morally, one could only expect divergent groups to be subject to the same rules, too, if they shared a common history and a common purpose, because that's where these rules gain their footing. That's how they have their foundation. And so if this is true, it's not that we wouldn't put up, that people don't put up with opposing gods if your God is all-powerful. It's not surprising that from perhaps 4,500 years ago, a chief god of some societies began to transform into an only god that's generally responsible for creating or else embodying the universe and its value structure. Now, the earliest written evidence of this is from some of this monotheism or monism. I would call it more monism in the East because God tended to embody the universe rather than create it. Is some passages from the Bible, some passages from the Vedas, and then Akhenaten's first hymn to the Aten in Egypt has a very strong monotheistic and exclusivist, universalist flavor to it. All of these are likely to have been composed in the second millennium BC, but they probably are representations of traditions that went far, that could have been even older. Now, the 5 main world religions grew out of early Jewish and Indian Chinese roots. There's the Aum of Hinduism, the Wheel of Dharma of Buddhism, the Cross of Jesus in Christianity, the Star of David for Judaism. And I should mention that Islam does not have a symbol, and this was relatively recently developed. It's not an official symbol of Islam, although the star and crescent is used to refer to it often. Oh, and looks like that's all we get. So anyway, so I go back to that particular slide, which is a series of interacting hypotheses for the correlated prehistory, as I would say, of social organization. That would be the bedrock. The social organization changes first, and then morality and religion changing in sort of in response to that. Now, there is one further phase that I want to end on, and this is the Vatican at night, where you can see the School of Athens by Raphael. You might be able to imagine it. It's we'll see it in a moment, but it's basically represents as a bunch of people talking to each other. Plato and Aristotle are in the middle arguing, and they're just having a grand old time in a beautiful, huge auditorium. And it represents something that's been possible for thousands of years. We see it in the Gilgamesh. It's been possible for thousands of years, and probably much, much, much longer than that, maybe even tens of thousands of years it's been possible. And it's been facilitated by some cultures at some times. But I'm on the last slide anyway, so you don't have to worry about changing anything if you don't.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the last slide, that's right. And I'm sure you'll be able to see it because we'll go through this, what I just did before. Yeah. Yeah, just once that stuff.
Don't watch it, it goes slow.
Right, yeah, okay. Okay, and that is, it's been possible for thousands of years, and it's been culturally facilitated in certain times in our history and certain places. And that's the ability to doubt, to talk about things, to think freely, to reason, to debate. And it involves individual exploration and appropriation of religion to oneself, and it can even involve developing of new religions, new denominations, as well as the formation of systematic theologies and religious doctrines. And it can even involve the rejection of organized religion itself, which has been done in about 14% of the world today, or the rejection, according to the CIA. I'm serious, 2007 CIA. 86% of the world supposedly is in one of those 5 religions I showed you on the last slide. As a matter of fact, even 4 of those religions, because Judaism is only a quarter of 1%. And 86% of the remainder do believe in God, but they just don't have an affiliation. But anyway, so there's about 2.3% of the world population has abandoned God. Now, I think that or belief in God, I think that this is something that we should consider as another phase in the evolution of religion. Even though it's not the evolution on a population level, it's individuals can, in some cases, strike out from the culture and make religion their own. And that is something that we all can do, and many people in the world have been able to do that for a long time. Now, I'd like to give you 3 take-home messages from this entire story that ends at this ability to independently think about religion and not be just a puppet of your culture. The first is the general hypothesis. Every transition that I presented here was the social environment of the people that facilitated a certain change in morality and religion. I suspect that.
You got it.
Yeah. I suspect that this has been the predominant mode of the evolution of religion. First, change in social environment, and then morality and religion continue. And in particular, I think it's the increase in communication between individuals that has, in between groups, that has facilitated most of the changes that I've talked about today. Now, 3 take-home messages. Second one, I'm going to try before this disappears, is that this theory needs testing. I've only, even if the general hypothesis and timeline are consistent, that's only, as I think they are, it's only consistent with existing evidence. So I want to find out how to develop predictions that would test particular hypotheses and work with those. And I have students that are working on this now, especially comparing beliefs among modern day groups of people in Africa. Now, thirdly, for the final take-home message, we need to zoom into the painting here. There we go. So that's all you need to see. Is the 2 central figures in the painting. I'll go back again so you can see where they come from. They're right in the middle there. Position of respect or honor. This is Plato and Aristotle. True to an important difference in their philosophies, I think. I'll look at some of these philosophies, I think. Plato is pointing upwards, perhaps indicating that reality and goodness are bestowed upon us from above. And Aristotle is saying, no, they're inherent in things. They're part of the things that exist. Reality and goodness are inherent in things. So here Raphael portrays them together, and they seem strangely harmonious, I think, actually, as if, I'm not going to put thoughts into the young Raphael like this, but as if they're both referring to aspects of the same truth somehow. But maybe that's just my projection, because this is exactly what I would like you to take from this talk on the origin of religion, or about the origin of religion, regardless of what the mechanism you think is. We can spend time now talking about this, the roots of religion, the natural history of it, the earthly origin, the mechanism, how religion came out of what was there before it was. But I don't think that any of this should prevent us from pointing upwards also, if we so choose. Thank you.
Well, that's great, and thank you too for doing it with the faults of the technology. Okay, over to you folks. Yes.
Regarding the chronological development of religion, did you touch any abrupt change in the behavior or the antiquity, what we discovered from any abrupt change, or was it like harmonious development?
Some of these things may not be abrupt changes in any one culture, but they are simultaneous changes, and that's the interesting thing. Why should we happen to see the Great Migration out of Africa, for instance, at the same time that, on completely other grounds, evolutionary linguists believe that that language became much more symbolic and able to be used in verbal communication, and also that on still other grounds, we see a shift to big game across the human species and a stronger reliance on cooperation or cooperative hunting rather than single hunting. These things beg an explanation that they may be symptoms of something else that changes, that has changed at that point that we can't see. And I think the same thing happens around 35 to 40,000 years ago. Why do we have clothing, ritualized burial, art, all these things happening at the same time, roughly? It suggests that something else has changed that's more fundamental to that. To me, anyway, it suggests that. And we see that even in more recent developments as well. So although it may not be abrupt, and it may, cultural evolution is fast, but it takes time for ideas to spread and things. So agriculture doesn't spread throughout the world for a much longer time than that. And of course, it hasn't completed spreading throughout the world even now. So whereas it's not, globally speaking, abrupt, there are a lot of apparent coincidences in how simultaneous they are.
Good, thank you. Martin?
Amongst evolutionary theorists of religion, there's a debate between the so-called adaptationists and the byproduct theorists. The adaptationists are those who believe that religion and supernatural thinking evolved because it conferred survival advantages to our ancestors. Byproduct theorists believe that supernatural thinking is a consequence of other cognitive mechanisms that evolved to solve problems in ancestral environments. I wanted to know what your view is. And secondly, do you think the rise of atheism in Western developed countries shows that we're still evolving?
Do we all hear that?
I think I should repeat the question.
So, okay, so I love the way you presented the first question, because I don't believe in either of those two things. And as a matter of fact, I think they make the mistake that I just talked about was very common in the first lecture. But anyway, the first possibility, Martin gave two general camps that most evolutionary theorists of religion reside in today. One of the adaptationists who believe that religion evolved by natural selection for its purpose, for its current function. The byproduct people believe that religion is a largely neutral trait and was made possible by things that had evolved for completely different other functions. Now, my position is neither of those, because I think that I agree with the byproduct people that religion used traits almost exclusively that had already evolved for other purposes. I think that's what physical anthropology and the phylogeny and what we know about the evolution of human cognition and the human brain, I think that these things that are important for religion have evolved long before these things that I was telling you about, these developments in the last 100,000 years. So that's what I'm led to there. However, I don't think just because it didn't evolve by natural selection and genetic change that it is not adaptive. See, these people all make the leap to thinking that it's neutral. And I do not think it's neutral. I think religion succeeded precisely because it was adaptive. Cultural traits can spread by natural selection too. And I don't mean Dawkins' idea of the meme spreading because it's good for itself, like a virus. I mean cultural traits can spread by natural selection because they are good for the individuals, regardless of whether they inherited them through the genes or learned them through social learning from other people. So it's not, there's no problem in evolutionary theory with saying that something is adaptive if it was purely cultural, because something that you learned can benefit your survival and reproduction. And if you tend to teach it to your children, then, and to the people that are around you, then it can succeed for that reason. I think that's exactly what happened with the evolution of religion. Now, as far as whether atheism represents further evolution, I think you're probably implying a progressivism that we're going towards something better by becoming atheists. But in reality, I don't think, even though all of the major transitions that I mentioned in the paper that this is derived from, it's an 8-stage process. And I think things get more the way I would want them to be with every stage, in the sense that I would rather have ancestor worship than nothing at all, and I would rather be free to think about how I want to appropriate religion to myself, rather than just being in a society that predominantly imposes monotheism on me, etc. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't regress if social environment changed in some other way. I think that if the social environment became fragmented in some kind of way, like for instance if we were to live in a kind of bubble like Ted was talking about with, or in Arizona or something, then we would, or on the moon or on Mars, I should say, then we may regress in terms of our morality. The trend line, the residuals, I'd be interested in being one of those, of course, somebody who did not regress. But what I'm suggesting is not a progressivist thesis of naturalistic cultural evolution. No. I think that we tended to go in this direction, ending at monotheism, because of our increased communication with other individuals, culminating in global communication. And cultural values of freedom of thought and those kinds of things facilitated individual appropriation, including atheism. So I would have to say that I would not accept a progressivist thesis like that.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, a sort of comment. Across the period you're talking about, there are enormous changes in climate. I mean, there's been an ice age from about 120 up to 10,000 BC. This whole northern hemisphere covered by ice sheets or tundra. And that vanished very quickly, about 10,000 BC, with very violent oscillations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the rise of agriculture is largely the result of a benign climate spreading across large areas.
I'm sorry, what was the last thing you said?
So the rise of things like agriculture,
Yeah.
because a place like Europe, really, people couldn't live there, same
right.
as North America,
Mhm.
was due to the spread partly of
Mhm.
benign climate across large parts of the Middle East and Europe.
Mhm.
And they were pretty well synchronous.
Mhm.
And some of those climate changes oscillated from cold to warm periods very quickly. So that there was, in a sense, already a mechanism there to synchronise cultural changes. And also it must have impressed itself very much, I'd have thought, on the local populations.
Yeah, I should make clear that when I said that a whole bunch of simultaneous changes at one time suggest a deeper underlying change that's also social, I believe that to be the case, but I think that there is a reason why even that social change happened at that particular moment. And it is not because of a genetic evolutionary cognitive change, because I don't think there were any hugely important ones during this time period. So that leaves us with the possibility that climatic changes could have been the reason why, for instance, at 12,000 years ago, we have agriculture independently sprouting up in 3 different places. And I think that's very, very likely.
But also, of course, there's large changes in sea level, about 150 metres, 200 metres,
Mhm.
as the ice sheets mounted, and that will isolated some populations and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It'd be interesting to take those into consideration. I have done so just a little bit with respect to the advent of agriculture, but I'm completely at a loss to explain what happened at 40,000 years ago.
I think there was a large cold period then, because in the ice age there were actually oscillations, and warm at some periods and cold other periods. I think there's a very marked cooling at that period, if I remember rightly.
Hmm.
Thank you. Yes.
Can you give some definition or explain this pre-religious animism?
That I use that to describe powers or spirits that need appeasing, and possibly ancestors too, who are surviving elders of the social group. But before the time in which those ancestors would have become fundamental interested parties in the life of the social group.
But why have we called this pre-religious? Because it demands some strict definition of religion.
That's right. So in terms of both my pre-moral and pre-religious label, I know I'm departing from a lot of other natural historians of religion, and it's because I am adopting a stricter definition of religion and a stricter definition of morality. And but it's purely semantic. I mean, if as long as you understand my definitions, you can follow my wording. There's no consensus here yet. So in order for something to be moral, I consider there to have to be explicit rule following and role taking. And in order for something to be religious, I believe that it has to be not only supernatural. As a matter of fact, I don't even have that as an essential part of the definition of religion. The essential part is that the thing that is followed, or the thing that is that elicits one devotion, is a fundamental aspect of life, not just something to be dealt with like any other problem of weather and technology and
But
lack.
when everything was sacred in this system, how can we say that it wasn't a fundamental part? Because it wasn't separated from other cultural systems. They were like unity in their worldview.
That may be true. There's some difference of opinion as to whether everything was sacred or not. As a matter of fact, the idea of everything being sacred in the Hindu tradition, for instance, isn't even really found in the Vedas. It's a later development in Hinduism. It's when basically the spirits that at one point are local, even domestic in the sense of being over one household or one compound, became to be interwoven with each other and interwoven with nature as a part of this sort of universalization of religion. But we could argue about that. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's very difficult to tell the difference between the sacred and secular, and I don't in prehistory, and I don't pretend to be very sure about that. So my definition of religion, especially where I apply it, could be on shaky ground. I fully admit that.
Great. Valerie.
You mentioned the Paleolithic site in Russia. Was it Kostelki?
Sungir?
So it's another one. Because there is a Kostelki site, which is, it was a science paper in 2007 that there have ritual burials from 40,000 years before present. And they processed food at 30,000 years before present.
Yeah.
And it means that they survived all those climatological Dangar, Oshger events, all the fluctuations. And there was a figurine found there, so it's not just basic animalistic life.
Yeah, I did not mean to suggest that the Sungir find was the earliest, like I did with some of the others, like the figurine from 10,000 years before that. There are many ritual burials with grave goods from about 40,000 years old, not too much before that, not anything before that that we know of with expensive grave goods. It's just that I was really struck by the opulence of that particular one, so I decided to use that as an example.
Great. Thank you. Yep.
From what I understood, it's an evolution, stage evolution, 8-stage evolution of religion. Is it
Cultural evolution,
Yes,
predominantly, yeah.
Has it stopped? Is there a ninth stage?
Well, my 8th stage is really just the individualization of decisions about these things. And so you can imagine that it just sort of, if you live in a society where that is permitted, then you can visit whatever stage you like individually. Now, and so it wouldn't make much sense to go to postulate a 9th stage, because 8th stage is freedom, essentially. But I would say that there are many groups where that is taken away, and you go back to something else, or to something that's completely separate and not even on the trajectory.
What is your intuition?
Where we're going?
Yeah, according to your ball of your apparatus.
Okay, now this is just my total speculation here.
That's what
But my total speculation is that this, and I'm going to sound like an American here, but this freedom thing is going to spread around the world, Pilgrim. And then eventually, I don't mean that we'll all be happy campers and they'll all be democratic societies. As a matter of fact, I think there's going to be plenty of tyranny, and we could destroy each other. I'm agnostic about that. But specifically with respect to private concerns, what somebody does in their own head about religion, it's going to be very, very difficult to prevent this idea that you can think about things for yourself and decide for yourself what you believe about the supernatural and about religious. I think it is very catchy, and it's a one-way street. Once you go there and you start thinking about these things and you start doubting what your parents tell you and that kind of thing and trying to appropriate it to yourself, there's nothing that's going to convince you to give that up again. So because of that one-way street thing, it's like Mueller's ratchet in biology, where you're going to continue to move this way and you're not going to go this way. So that's why I said it's going to spread around the world.
Thank you.
Jeff. Yeah.
Thank you for your reply to the question about byproduct and adaptationist theories. And that, I mean, that's surely true that something can arise as a spandrel, but then it can have fitness benefits either through cultural elaboration or even through straightforward natural selection. So I'm with you on that. I thought that was an elegant answer. Here's my question. Why do you link the origin and development? And by the way, I think there are good empirical data to suggest that later on, at least, by virtue of the interaction between religion and morality, there may be benefits in stabilizing cooperation and other things. But my question is this: why do you link religion and morality so far back? And how do you deal
You
with...
think they're converged in their
well,
linkage?
all the way back with pre-religious animism and and whatever you called it. I mean, you've tracked...
Because...
And if I can just put
Oh, yeah.
empirical teeth in the question, and I'm agnostic about these studies, but you get somebody like Jonathan Haidt, who argues that moral judgment is an ancient feature of our cognition that has nothing to do with belief in religion, has nothing to do with, in fact, any rational justification, intuitive judgments. And then, lots of so there you go. Why do you link those? So
Well, when you say that, so his view of morality is just what I call pre-moral sociality. That's the reason why he can have it unlinked with religion, is because I have it unlinked with religion too. I just call it something else. It's the same. So there we don't have that much of a difference. The difference comes at the point where we develop the ability to represent our rules in such a way that they become standards, explicit standards that one can either follow or not follow, and roles in life that can be justified or not justified, and someone can stick to them or not stick to them. And once that happens, that's when I start calling it morality. I don't start calling it morality when it is only a difference in degree from the mutual parceled grooming between chimps. You know what I mean? I wouldn't want to call that morality, and so I don't call it morality when there's reciprocity between early humans either. Only when those, I think the next fundamental step in the evolution of morality is when they become explicit rules rather than vague standards on which we have sort of a tacit agreement. Now that may not be a good enough reason to start calling it something different, but for me it's sort of a fundamental change. But the reason why I link morality at that point, when I start calling it morality, when it's explicit rule following, to religion, is because at that point, as well as for just about every other point in human history, I think that group against group competition was the single most important determinant of reproductive success and of individual survival. And therefore, cooperation within groups was the single most important thing that an individual had to do in face of that group against group competition. And so it was essentially fundamental in the life of the early human group, 100,000 years ago and more, to cooperate with each other. And since it's at variance with individual selfishness, of course, I think most of the rules that would have come out then would have been about service to the group. And since it's so fundamental, if there was any likelihood that these rules could be placed on a more firm base than just your elder telling you them, I think it would have been adopted. And it was possible that ancestors could have been worshipped at that time because of the slight step it was from obeying your elders, obeying the rules when the elders had died, because now we have explicit rule following, and then believing that the elders were still there after they died. No?
This is such a rich conversation, and I'm agnostic on these issues, but just a quick comeback. So, the work of Jesse Baring and Pascal Boyer, they would suggest that believing that humans survive death, in fact, believing that most living organisms survive death, and Paul Bloom calls it, native dualism, that these two are anciently rooted.
How ancient? You mean older than 100,000 years ago?
Yeah, because
but what evidence do we have for that?
well, the evidence is data from cognitive psychology that says that people, even people who say that they don't believe that there are ghosts or people, that people survive death, in a variety of empirical settings, manifest innate dispositions toward those beliefs.
like I said, I'm conservative with this. Nothing that you've said so far has pushed me to thinking that it is any earlier than 100,000 years ago, as long as we were all in Africa. But it's very difficult to adjudicate between 100,000 and, you know, I think the next major event is like, you know, 400,000 years ago. So, you know, who knows?
Interesting debates. Any more? Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yeah, and 5 minutes to go, so, yeah.
I wonder what role you think direct religious experience played in all this.
Well, my Ann Arbor colleagues told me very little. Told me that they played very little role, so I guess they played very. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I think they probably played a great role early on, and if we can take the analogies with current cultures, for whom the other aspects of religion are similar to what I'm calling the earlier stages of our own history. Experiential element is very important. As we tend to intellectualize our experience, the experiential phenomenological element of religion can sometimes take a back seat. I don't know if that answers your question.
Ernest.
Thank you for a very interesting story of development of religion. One aspect of development of religion that I want to ask you how you might incorporate it is the phenomenon of the prophet. Because the distinctive thing in many religions is the prophet is the person who bucks the society, who goes against the worldview of the time and so on.
Right.
And so and yet there's often the important person in the next developmental stage of a particular religion. So it seems not to arise out of the social situation in one sense, as it is, but is going against the social situation.
Right. Well, actually, I think by and large, a prophet who proposes something, and I've written about this with respect to Jesus, a prophet who writes something or says something that goes against the cultural system, but benefits the people in terms of social organization, or benefits the powers that be. Power disparities are an important thing to mention here, and I have not mentioned those. Will be a driving force in this cultural evolution. So I haven't actually said what the mechanism of cultural evolution is in these cases, but I think at least since 40,000 years ago, when hereditary leadership weakened, that's another thing that happened around the same time, is with the increased interaction between groups, you have the possibility that people can be rulers of multiple groups. You have a breakdown of the nice, clean hereditary system. When that happens, prophets who do not have any blood claim to be able to say anything at all, increasingly, I think, would have had a role in pushing cultural evolution into areas that would have been beneficial to the people, or to themselves at least.
Now there are two people who had their hands up. Dennis was, I think, first, and then Karen. We might just about have time.
Go for Karen first. Mine is a really long. I mean, it's not a short question, but it's a difficult one. Go for
Okay.
Yeah,
Maybe this could be a yes. I don't know.
okay, that's
I'm kind of pulling some things. I haven't read anything about this in many years. I'm kind of pulling this out of the back reaches of my head. My understanding was that Cro-Magnon came on the scene about 30 to 40,000 years ago, and you didn't really differentiate between Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and that evolution. So I was wondering how you might see that as the emergence of some of these things that you identify as 40,000 years ago as being part of the development of Cro-Magnon and the cerebral cortex.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that, I ignored subdivisions within Homo sapiens, and I also ignored Neanderthals. My views on Neanderthals are rather, well, first, my view of divisions between Homo sapiens, I think that they are relatively unimportant after 100,000 years ago. So I think the differences between different human groups in different places, whether they've been given different names or not, are relatively immaterial. I could be wrong about that. That's just a null hypothesis, and I'm just waiting for someone to tell me that that's not the case, that we had an important difference between different human groups after that point, large, like subspecies differences or something. Now, with respect to Neanderthals, I know that they were buried with some kind of ceremony, in that there's pollen and flowers that were buried with them. But I think that's about as far as we can go. I think that Neanderthals were behind, very much behind, in all of the aspects that I was talking about, and that their extinction in competition with Homo sapiens is a very strong hypothesis that I would accept, and I pretty strong evidence for that, I think, in that there's a limited interbreeding between humans and Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis. So I think I exclude them from concern with this too. I think Homo sapiens, and I'll go out on a limb here, but I think Homo sapiens, based on my understanding of religion, are the only religious species ever to have existed.
Thank you. Well, Dennis, we've got a few. We'll take a 5-minute break.
5-minute break, yeah. Have a 5-minute break.
Okay. Well, let's thank David for that great talk.